My brother changed the locks on Mom's house during her funeral and claimed it as his inheritance. But the property deed had a surprise. My mother lived in the same house for 35 years, the one where me, my brother Dean, and sister Amy grew up. When she got sick with cancer, we took turns taking care of her. Well, Amy and I did. Dean showed up twice in 6 months, both times asking Mom about her will and if the house was paid off. Mom would change the subject and he'd leave angry. Amy drove from 3 hours away every weekend to help with chemo appointments. I moved back into my old room temporarily to handle nights when Mom couldn't sleep from the pain. Dean lived 20 minutes away and couldn't be bothered unless it was about money. The last time he visited, Mom was barely conscious, and he spent the whole time going through her filing cabinet looking for bank statements. When Mom passed on a Tuesday morning, I was holding her hand while Amy sang her favorite hymn. Dean didn't answer his phone until we'd already called the funeral home. His first question wasn't about arrangements or how we were doing. He asked if Mom had left any instructions about the house. At the funeral planning, while Amy and I picked flowers and music, Dean kept asking about the estate lawyer's contact information. He said we needed to be practical about assets. The funeral director looked disgusted. Amy told Dean to show some respect, and he said he was just trying to handle things like Mom would want. We had the service that Friday morning. Dean showed up late in jeans and left early saying he had something urgent to handle. Amy gave a beautiful eulogy about Mom's kindness. I read her favorite poem. Dean sat in the back texting. We thought he was just being his usual selfish self. After the burial, everyone went to Amy's house for the reception since she'd coordinated all the food, and Mom's friends knew the address. Dean said he couldn't make it, something about a work emergency. We were honestly relieved he wouldn't be there to make everyone uncomfortable with his money questions. About 2 hours into the reception, Amy's neighbor called her. She lived 2 streets over from Mom's house and saw a locksmith truck in the driveway. Amy tried calling Dean, but he didn't answer. I drove over immediately while Amy stayed with the guests. When I got there, Dean was directing some moving guys who were carrying his furniture into Mom's house. The locks were already changed and he had new keys on his belt. I asked what he was doing and he said he was moving in. He said possession was 9/10 of the law and since Mom didn't have a will, the house would go to whoever was living in it. He actually said I should have thought of it first if I wanted the house. The locksmith was packing up and looked uncomfortable when I said our mother's funeral was literally still happening. Dean told him it was fine, that he'd inherited the property. When I tried to go inside, Dean blocked the door and said it was his house now. He'd already moved his clothes into the master bedroom. Mom's bed wasn't even cold and he'd thrown her quilts in the hallway. Her medications were swept into a garbage bag by the door. Her photos were stacked on the floor so he could hang his flat-screen TV. He'd clearly researched this. He'd planned it while Mom was dying. That night, Amy and I went to Mom's lawyer even though it was after hours. We'd called him urgently and he met us at his office. We explained what Dean did and asked about the estate process. The lawyer started laughing. Not a mean laugh, but like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. He asked if Dean really thought Mom didn't have a will. We said Dean had been asking about it for months and Mom always changed the subject. The lawyer pulled out Mom's file. She'd updated her will a year ago when she got diagnosed. The house wasn't going to any of us. She'd left it to her church with instructions to sell it and use the money for their homeless shelter program. She'd written a letter explaining that Dean only cared about money, so he'd get none. Amy and I were each getting $50,000 from her life insurance, plus all her personal belongings that were already moved to a storage unit she'd secretly rented and given us keys to. Dean got nothing except a note saying she forgave him for being heartless but wouldn't enable it. The lawyer called the church's attorney that evening. By Monday morning, Dean was served with eviction papers. Then the church discovered something in the house after the eviction. Clayton called my cell around 7 on Monday evening. I was heating up leftovers from the funeral reception when his name popped up on my screen. He asked if Amy and I could come to his office first thing Tuesday morning, because the church's property inspector found something during the post-eviction walkthrough. His voice had this weird mix of amusement and disgust that made my stomach twist. He wouldn't tell me details over the phone, but said we needed to see this ourselves. I called Amy right after, and she agreed to drive down that night so we could go together in the morning. Neither of us slept much wondering what they'd found. We pulled into Clayton's parking lot at 7:55 Tuesday morning. Mackenzie Barker from the church was already in the conference room when we walked in. She had a thick folder sitting on the table in front of her, and she looked angry in a way that seemed professional but personal too. Clayton gestured for us to sit down, and Mackenzie opened the folder without any small talk. She spread photos across the conference table in neat rows, like she was laying out evidence for a trial. The first thing I noticed was Mom's bedroom looking completely different. There were 3 separate keypad locks installed on bedroom doors. Cheap furniture I'd never seen before. Generic wall art from discount stores. Mackenzie explained that Dean had been running an illegal Airbnb operation out of Mom's house for at least 6 months. My brain couldn't process what she was saying at first. Amy grabbed my hand under the table and squeezed hard. Mackenzie kept pulling out more photos showing how Dean had converted 3 bedrooms into rental units with those separate locks. He'd advertised the place online as a charming family home experience and charged guests $200 per night. The listing photos showed Mom's living room staged with throw pillows and fake plants. Her kitchen had been cleared of all her personal items and set up like a vacation rental. There were professional photos of the backyard with captions about peaceful suburban retreat. Dean had turned our childhood home into a business while Mom was dying in the hospital. The photos showed every room transformed into generic rental space. Mom's reading chair was gone from the corner where she'd sat every evening. Her collection of ceramic birds had been packed away. The walls where family photos hung for 30 years were bare except for cheap landscape prints. Mackenzie flipped to another section showing the actual listings online. Dean had created a whole fake host profile with a made-up story about the property. He'd written descriptions about the home's warm atmosphere and family-friendly environment. Reviews from guests talked about the comfortable beds and well-stocked kitchen. People had been sleeping in Mom's house, using her things, living in her space while she was too sick to know. Amy started crying quietly next to me. I felt this cold rage building in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. Mackenzie pulled out printed booking records they'd found hidden in boxes in the garage. The records showed Dean had made over $30,000 renting out Mom's house to strangers. The bookings started in March, right after Mom's cancer diagnosis when she began spending more time in the hospital for treatments. He'd been doing this for 6 months while Amy drove 3 hours every weekend to help with appointments. While I moved back home to take care of Mom at night. While we were exhausted and scared and watching her fade away, Dean was collecting cash from tourists who wanted a cheap place to stay near the downtown area. The records showed he'd had guests almost every weekend from March through September. Sometimes multiple guests at once in different bedrooms. He'd been running a whole operation with cleaning schedules and key exchange instructions and pricing for extra services. I felt sick looking at the numbers and dates. July was when Mom's pain got really bad and she couldn't sleep through the night anymore. That same month, Dean had 12 different bookings and made $4,000. August was when we started hospice care at home, and Dean claimed he was too busy with work to visit. He had 15 bookings that month and cleared almost $5,000. Amy was crying harder now, and Mackenzie pushed a box of tissues across the table. Clayton sat back in his chair looking disgusted. He said this significantly strengthened the eviction case because Dean had been conducting illegal commercial activity in a residential zone. The church wanted to pursue criminal charges for the unauthorized business operation and theft of rental income from property he never owned. Mackenzie explained that running a short-term rental business violated zoning laws, and Dean had never gotten permits or paid taxes on the income. We spent the next 2 hours going through all the evidence with them. There were reviews online from guests praising the host for being responsive and helpful. Photos of complete strangers sitting on Mom's couch, cooking in her kitchen, sleeping in her bed, using her bathroom. One couple had posted pictures of their anniversary dinner at Mom's dining room table with candles and wine. They'd written about what a lovely, peaceful home it was. Another family had reviewed the place, saying their kids loved playing in the backyard. There were dozens of photos of people I'd never met living in my mother's house while she was dying. Mackenzie showed us one review from July that made my hands shake. A guest mentioned that the owner's son had stopped by to collect extra cleaning fees in cash. The review praised Dean for being so professional and accommodating. Dean had been physically going to the house during Mom's final months to squeeze every possible dollar out of the rental operation. He'd been there taking money from strangers while refusing to visit Mom at the hospital 20 minutes away. Clayton said he was filing additional legal motions that afternoon to freeze any assets Dean had received from the illegal rentals. If we could prove he'd been operating a business on property he didn't own, he'd have to return every cent plus penalties and fines. The church was also reporting him to the IRS for unreported income and to the county for zoning violations. Mackenzie gathered up all the photos and documents back into her folder. She apologized for having to show us something so upsetting, but said we needed to know the full extent of what Dean had done. Clayton walked us out to the parking lot and promised to keep us updated on the legal proceedings. Amy and I sat in my car for 10 minutes before either of us could speak. Finally, Amy said we should go see the house ourselves now that Dean had been evicted. The church had changed the locks again and given us keys since we were executors of the personal property Mom had left us. I drove to Mom's street with Amy silent in the passenger seat. The house looked the same from outside, but I knew everything inside had been violated and changed. Inside, the living room looked nothing like Mom's house anymore. Dean had replaced her soft floral couch with a black leather sectional that took up half the room. Her collection of family photos that used to cover the mantel was gone, replaced by a generic landscape painting still showing the price sticker. The walls were bare except for nail holes where she'd hung pictures of us growing up. I walked to the corner where her reading chair used to sit, the one with the worn armrest where she'd rest her coffee mug every morning. Empty space now, just carpet indentations showing where furniture used to be. Amy opened the hall closet and found it stuffed with folded sheets and towels, all brand new with tags still attached. Dean had bought everything in bulk for his rental guests. We moved through the kitchen where Mom's ceramic mixing bowls were replaced with cheap plastic containers. Her spice rack was gone. Her cookie jar shaped like an apple that Dad bought her on their anniversary was nowhere in sight. Amy started opening drawers and cabinets, finding nothing but basic utensils and plain white dishes. Everything that made this place Mom's home had been erased. The basement stairs creaked the same way they always had. At least Dean hadn't changed that. But downstairs looked like a storage facility. Boxes stacked against walls with labels like linens and kitchen supplies. In the far corner near the water heater, I spotted black garbage bags tied shut. Amy went over and opened the first one. She pulled out Mom's wedding album, the white leather cover stained with something dark. Inside were photos of Mom and Dad on their wedding day, Mom looking so young and happy. The album had been shoved in with old newspapers and what looked like food wrappers. Amy was crying again as she dug deeper into the bag. Dad's military medals from Vietnam were loose at the bottom, the ribbons tangled and torn. His bronze star was scratched like someone had stepped on it. Mom kept these in a special display case in her bedroom. Dean had thrown them away like trash. The second garbage bag held Mom's book collection. She loved old books and spent years finding first editions at estate sales. Her copy of To Kill a Mockingbird signed by Harper Lee was bent in half. A first edition Catcher in the Rye had coffee stains on the cover. These books were worth thousands of dollars, and Mom treasured them more than anything except her family. Dean had stuffed them in garbage bags to make room for strangers. We carried the bags upstairs and set them by the front door. The master bedroom made me feel sick. Dean had removed Mom's bed completely, replacing it with a king-size platform bed with gray sheets. Her dresser was gone. Her nightstand was gone. The quilt her mother made her was nowhere in the room. New curtains covered the windows, dark blue instead of Mom's yellow ones that let in morning light. On the wall where Mom kept photos of us as kids, Dean had mounted a flat-screen TV. But what caught my eye was a metal lockbox bolted to the wall inside the closet. It had a combination lock and looked new. Amy said she'd check the garage for tools to open it. I stayed in the bedroom looking at how completely Dean had erased our mother from her own space. 5 minutes later, Amy came back with a small key. She said she found it in the garage hanging on a pegboard with a label that said, Master Bedroom. The key fit the lockbox. Inside were stacks of $20 and $50 bills, bundled with rubber bands. We counted it twice to be sure. $4,200 in cash. Dean had been collecting money from his rental guests and hiding it in Mom's closet. I took photos of everything with my phone, then called Clayton. He answered on the second ring, and I explained what we found. He told us to leave the money exactly where it was, and take more photos showing the lockbox location and the cash inside. He said this proved Dean was running a cash business, and probably not reporting the income to the IRS. That opened up a whole new set of legal problems for Dean. Clayton said he'd contact the church's attorney right away, and they'd decide how to proceed with this evidence. We locked the house and sat in my car for a while, both of us too upset to drive. That evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. It was Dean's lawyer, a man named Richard something. He said Dean wanted to negotiate a settlement. Dean would return the house peacefully and drop any ownership claims if we agreed not to pursue criminal charges for the rental operation. Richard said Dean made a mistake and wanted to make things right without involving the courts. I told Richard I needed to discuss it with Amy and Clayton and would get back to him. 20 minutes later, Clayton called saying Richard had contacted him too. Clayton set up a conference call for the next morning with him, Mackenzie, Amy, and me. On the call, Mackenzie said the church had discussed Dean's offer and decided to reject it. She said Dean's actions were so deliberately harmful during Mom's final months that they wanted to move forward with charges. The church felt strongly that someone who would profit from his dying mother's home while refusing to visit her deserved consequences. Clayton asked what Amy and I wanted to do. I thought about Mom's letter that Clayton had read to us, the one where she said Dean should face consequences for being heartless. Running a business out of her house while she was dying definitely qualified. Amy agreed. We told Clayton and Mackenzie to reject the deal. 2 days later, Clayton called to say the county prosecutor's office had contacted him. They were interested in filing charges against Dean for operating an illegal commercial enterprise and theft. The rental income exceeded the threshold for serious fraud, which meant potential jail time. The prosecutor wanted to meet with us to discuss the evidence and get our statements. That same afternoon, Clayton called again. Antonio Dominguez, the locksmith Dean hired, had reached out through Clayton's office. Antonio said Dean told him it was an emergency estate situation, and he felt terrible about being part of the scheme. He wanted to testify about what Dean said when hiring him. Clayton scheduled a meeting with Antonio for the following week. When we met Antonio at Clayton's office, he looked nervous and kept apologizing. He explained that Dean had called him on the morning of the funeral saying he needed locks changed immediately on a property he'd just inherited. Antonio said Dean specifically asked him to come during the funeral hours because the family would be distracted, and he wanted to avoid drama. Dean paid him $300 in cash to rush the job and not ask questions about why it needed to happen so fast. Antonio said he realized something was wrong when I showed up and mentioned the funeral was still happening. He went home that night and told his wife what happened, and she said he needed to come forward if the situation was illegal. Antonio brought copies of his work order showing the date and time, plus the cash payment Dean made. Clayton thanked him and said his testimony would be valuable for the prosecutor's case. That same evening, Amy's phone rang while we were having dinner at her place and trying to process everything with Antonio's testimony. She answered, and I could tell from her face it was important. When she hung up, she said it was Lila Bentley, Mom's neighbor who lived 3 doors down and had known our family for 20 years. Lila told Amy she'd been wanting to call us, but didn't know if it was her place to get involved in family business. She said she'd noticed strange things happening at Mom's house for months, starting back in March when Mom's hospital stays got longer. Lila saw people with suitcases showing up at odd hours, different cars in the driveway almost every week, and strangers taking photos of the house from the street. At first, she thought maybe Mom was taking in boarders to help pay for medical bills, which wouldn't have been unusual given how expensive cancer treatment was. But something felt off about it because the people coming and going didn't look like they belonged there, and they never stayed more than a few days at a time. Lila said she almost called us back in June when she saw a couple arguing in Mom's driveway at midnight about the Wi-Fi password not working. Amy put the phone on speaker so I could hear, and Lila explained that she'd started taking photos of license plates from the rental cars because she wanted evidence in case something bad was happening to Mom. She had dozens of photos on her phone dating back 5 months, all time-stamped and showing different vehicles parked in Mom's driveway. Lila offered to send everything to Amy right away and said she'd be happy to talk to the prosecutor if it would help our case against Dean. Amy thanked her and gave her Clayton's contact information so she could send the photos directly to him as evidence. Within an hour, Clayton called saying Lila's documentation was perfect for building a timeline of Dean's operation. The license plates matched rental car companies and the dates lined up with gaps in the Airbnb booking records we'd found. Prosecutors could now prove Dean was running this scheme for at least 6 months, not just a few weeks like his lawyer might try to claim. 3 days later, Mackenzie called to say the church was holding a meeting about what to do with Mom's house, now that all the legal issues with Dean were being handled. She invited Amy and me to attend if we wanted to hear their plans. We drove to the church that Thursday evening and met with about 15 people from the board and various committees. Bernadette Morgan, who ran the homeless shelter program Mom had been supporting for years, stood up and explained their vision for the property. She said they wanted to renovate Mom's house into a transitional living home for families getting back on their feet after homelessness. The plan was to create 4 private bedroom spaces for families while keeping the common areas for shared meals and support services. Bernadette talked about how hard it was for families with kids to find stable housing, and how having a safe place to stay while parents looked for work and saved money could change everything for them. The church board voted right there to move forward with the renovation plan and start a fundraising campaign to cover the costs beyond what the house sale would provide. After the meeting, Bernadette came over and asked if Amy and I would like to tour the current shelter facility to see the kind of work Mom's donation would be supporting. We agreed and scheduled a visit for the following Saturday. The shelter was in an old converted school building downtown, and when we walked in, the place was busy with families. Bernadette introduced us to several people who were staying there temporarily. We met a single mom named Maria, who was working 2 jobs while her kids stayed in the shelter's childcare program. She told us about losing her apartment after her ex-husband stopped paying child support, and how the shelter gave her a safe place to figure things out. Another family, a couple with 3 kids, explained how medical debt from their youngest son's surgery had wiped out their savings, and they'd ended up living in their car until the shelter took them in. The dad had just started a new job and they were saving for a security deposit on an apartment. Everyone we met was working hard and just needed some support to get stable again. Watching these families and hearing their stories made me understand exactly why Mom chose to leave her house for this program. These weren't people looking for handouts or trying to take advantage of anyone. They were regular folks who hit hard times and needed help getting back on track, exactly the kind of people Mom always wanted to support. Driving home from the shelter, I finally understood why Mom planned everything so carefully and kept it secret from Dean. She knew he would try something greedy and selfish when she died. She'd watched him for years only caring about money and never showing up when family needed him. By leaving the house to the church instead of splitting it between us kids, she made sure it would actually help people who needed it instead of funding Dean's lifestyle. Mom could have just divided everything equally and let us fight about it, but she chose to do something meaningful with her biggest asset. She wanted her house to give families a safe place and a second chance, not sit empty or get sold off for cash that Dean would waste. The whole plan, from the secret storage unit with our personal items to the specific instructions about the homeless shelter, showed how much thought Mom put into this. She wasn't just writing a will, she was making sure her values lived on after she was gone. 3 weeks after Antonio came forward with his testimony, Clayton called with news that the county prosecutor had officially filed charges against Dean. The charges included multiple counts of fraud for claiming ownership of property that wasn't his, theft for taking rental income from a house he didn't own, operating an illegal business without proper licenses or permits, and tax evasion for not reporting the $30,000 he made from the Airbnb scheme. Clayton explained that the combination of charges meant Dean was facing serious consequences, possibly including jail time if convicted on all counts. The prosecutor was treating this as a major case because of how calculated Dean's actions were and the fact that he did everything during Mom's funeral. The court date was set for 2 months out, which gave prosecutors time to build their case using all the evidence from Antonio, Lila, the booking records, and the cash we found hidden in the house. 2 days after the charges were filed, Amy's phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She answered, and it was Dean's mother-in-law, his wife's mom, calling to ask us to drop the criminal charges. The woman said Dean had 3 young kids who needed their father, and that sending him to jail would destroy the whole family. She tried to make us feel guilty by talking about Dean's children growing up without a dad and how hard it would be for his wife to manage alone. Amy stayed calm and told her that Dean should have thought about his kids before he committed multiple crimes during our mother's funeral. She explained that we didn't force Dean to run an illegal business out of Mom's house or lie about owning the property. Those were choices he made knowing he had a family to support, and now he had to face the results of those choices. The mother-in-law got angry and said we were being cruel and heartless. That family should stick together no matter what. Amy reminded her that Dean didn't stick with his family when Mom was dying and needed help, so he couldn't expect us to protect him now from his own actions. She said we weren't dropping the charges and hung up. The next week, Clayton called with more news about Dean's situation. He said Dean's wife had filed for separation and was moving back to her parents' house with the kids. Clayton heard this through Dean's lawyer during some procedural discussions about the case. Apparently, Dean's wife had no idea about the Airbnb scheme until the charges were filed, and everything came out in court documents. Finding out that her husband had been that calculated and dishonest during a family tragedy was the final straw for her. She'd already been upset about Dean's behavior at the funeral and his refusal to help care for Mom during her illness. But learning he'd been running a secret business and planning to steal the house pushed her over the edge. Clayton said the separation would probably help Dean's wife in the long run, because it showed she didn't support his actions and wasn't involved in the illegal activity. For Dean, though, it meant losing his family on top of facing criminal charges. About a week after that, Clayton called again to tell us the IRS had sent Dean a letter requesting full documentation of all his income for the past 3 years. The tax agency wanted bank statements, receipts, and records of every dollar Dean earned or received during that time. Clayton explained this was standard procedure when someone was charged with tax evasion, but it could create huge problems for Dean beyond the criminal case. If Dean couldn't prove he'd reported and paid taxes on the Airbnb income, he'd owe back taxes plus penalties and interest on $30,000. The penalties for unreported income could double or triple what he actually owed, and the IRS didn't care about excuses or hard luck stories. They wanted their money, and they had ways of getting it that went beyond what criminal courts could do. Clayton warned us this could hurt Dean financially for years, even after any jail sentence ended. The IRS could garnish his wages, seize assets, and put liens on any property he tried to buy in the future. That weekend, Amy and I decided it was finally time to properly clean out Mom's house before the church started their renovation work. We had keys from Mackenzie and spent Saturday morning going through every room carefully, looking for family items Dean might have hidden or thrown away. In the garage, I climbed up to check the rafters and found our grandmother's china set wrapped in old blankets and shoved way back in the corner. The dishes had been in our family for 3 generations, and Mom treasured them, but Dean must have hidden them up there to make room for his rental furniture. We carefully brought down all 12 place settings plus the serving pieces, not a single plate broken. In the basement, Amy discovered Dad's photo albums under the stairs behind some boxes of old paint cans. There were 6 albums covering Dad's whole life from childhood, through his time in the military, until he died when we were teenagers. Mom used to look through these albums when she missed Dad, and finding them dusty and was forgotten in the basement made us both angry all over again at how little Dean cared about family history. We loaded everything into Amy's car along with Mom's jewelry box, her recipe collection, and a quilt her mother had made that we found wadded up in the back of a closet. By the end of the weekend, we'd recovered dozens of meaningful family items that Dean had treated like garbage, and we moved it all to the storage unit Mom had prepared for us where it would be safe and respected the way she'd wanted. Bernadette called 2 days later asking if we could come by the church office to see something. Amy and I drove over that Thursday afternoon and found her waiting with a set of rolled-up papers spread across the conference table. She smiled and started showing us the plans her architect friend had drawn up for converting Mom's house into a transitional living space. The design showed 4 separate bedrooms, each with enough room for a small family to have privacy. There would be a shared kitchen where residents could cook together and learn budgeting skills. The living room would become a common area with space for kids to do homework and families to spend time together. Bernadette explained that each family would have their own bathroom too, giving them dignity and independence while they worked on getting back on their feet. She pointed to where they'd add a small office for caseworkers to meet with residents and help them find jobs or permanent housing. Mom would have loved seeing how her house would give people exactly the kind of support they needed. The plans even included a small garden area in the backyard where families could grow vegetables and teach their kids about taking care of things. Amy started crying looking at the drawings because it was so clear that Mom's gift would make a real difference for people who needed help. The church started their fundraising campaign the next week. Bernadette put together a presentation about Mom's life and her decision to leave her house for homeless families instead of her own kids. She included the part about Dean's behavior during Mom's illness and how Mom had written that letter explaining why he got nothing. When the church shared Mom's story at Sunday service and posted it on their website, donations started coming in fast. People in the community were moved by Mom's generosity and wanted to support the renovation work. Within 3 days, they'd raised $15,000 from local families who'd known Mom or just respected what she was trying to do. A construction company that did work for the church offered to donate labor for the renovation. A furniture store said they'd provide beds and tables for all 4 family units. The local grocery store committed to providing food baskets for the first month each new family moved in. Watching the community come together to honor Mom's wishes felt amazing. Amy and I went to a planning meeting where Bernadette showed us letters from people explaining why they donated. One woman wrote that she'd been homeless with her kids 10 years ago and wished a place like this had existed then. Another family donated because Mom had been kind to them when they were struggling years back. The fundraising total hit $30,000 within 2 weeks, enough to cover most of the renovation costs. Clayton called during the fundraising campaign with another update about Dean's case. He said Dean's lawyer had submitted a statement claiming Dean was just house sitting, and the Airbnb was meant to cover utility bills while he watched the property. Clayton sounded annoyed explaining this because the booking records proved Dean charged $200 per night and kept every cent as pure profit. The utility bills for those 6 months showed Dean never paid a single one. The electric company had sent 3 disconnect notices. The water bill went unpaid for 4 months. Dean had pocketed $30,000 and let the utilities go into collections, probably planning to deal with it after he'd established squatters' rights. Clayton said this defense strategy was making things worse for Dean because it showed he was lying even now about his intentions. The prosecutor was using Dean's current dishonesty to argue he'd been dishonest from the start and couldn't be trusted to follow any plea agreement. A few days after that call, Amy was going through an old computer we'd found in Mom's basement. She was looking for photos or documents we might have missed when she found Dean's email account still logged in. She called me over to look at what she'd discovered. There were emails going back over a year showing Dean researching squatters' rights and adverse possession laws. He'd contacted 3 different lawyers asking about how to claim property through occupation. One email from 14 months ago, when Mom had just gotten her cancer diagnosis, asked specifically about changing locks and establishing residence during an estate transition. Another email showed Dean had joined an online forum about property rights and posted questions about taking control of inherited homes. He'd been planning this whole thing since Mom first got sick. All those months when Amy and I were taking Mom to chemo and sitting with her through bad nights, Dean was plotting how to steal her house. He wasn't just being selfish in the moment or making a bad choice out of grief. He'd spent over a year researching and planning exactly how to take the house the second Mom died. Looking at those emails made everything so much worse. I'd thought maybe Dean had panicked at the funeral and made a terrible decision without thinking it through. But no, he'd been waiting for Mom to die so he could execute his plan. He'd probably been hoping she wouldn't make a will, or that he could contest it somehow. Every time he'd asked Mom about the house and she changed the subject, he must have been calculating his next move. The level of planning was disturbing. Dean had bookmarked articles about estate law. He'd saved screenshots of forum posts about successful property claims. He'd even researched which locksmiths in the area would do rush jobs for cash. This wasn't impulse or grief or even regular greed. This was cold calculation over many months while our mother was dying. Dean's preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the charges were filed. Amy and I both took the day off work to attend. We sat in the courtroom gallery and watched Dean walk in wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit right. He looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because he wasn't standing in Mom's doorway blocking us out anymore. The prosecutor laid out the evidence piece by piece. The Airbnb booking records showing $30,000 in rental income. The utility bills Dean never paid. The locksmith's testimony about being hired during the funeral. Antonio looked uncomfortable on the stand, but told the truth about everything Dean had said and done. The prosecutor showed the judge photos of Mom's belongings thrown in garbage bags, and Dean's furniture moved into her bedroom. Then they brought up the emails Amy had found showing Dean's year-long planning. The prosecutor called it premeditated theft and fraud. Dean's lawyer tried to argue his client was just confused about a state law and made mistakes. But when the judge asked why someone confused about the law would research it for over a year before acting, the lawyer didn't have a good answer. Dean's lawyer spent 20 minutes trying to negotiate some kind of plea deal with probation and community service. He argued that Dean had 3 kids and no prior criminal record. He said jail time would hurt Dean's family more than it would help anyone. The prosecutor wasn't having it. She told the judge that Dean's crimes happened during his own mother's funeral, that he'd been planning them since she got her cancer diagnosis, and that he'd stolen $30,000 while his sisters were grieving. She said the deliberate nature of everything Dean did, plus his continued lying about his intentions, meant he needed real consequences. The judge listened to both sides and asked Dean directly if he had anything to say. Dean stood up and mumbled something about making bad choices and being sorry. It sounded fake even from across the courtroom. The judge didn't look impressed. The judge set bail at $50,000. Dean's face went white when he heard the amount. His lawyer asked for a reduction, explaining Dean didn't have that kind of money available. The judge said that someone who'd stolen $30,000 and run an illegal business should be able to post reasonable bail. She denied the reduction request. After the hearing ended, we learned through Clayton that Dean's wife's family refused to help with bail money. His friends apparently weren't willing to put up cash for someone who'd steal from his dying mother either. Dean had to use his own savings, probably a big chunk of what he'd made from the Airbnb scheme. Watching him realize he was alone in this felt like justice starting to happen. The sentencing hearing came 4 months later after Dean pleaded guilty to avoid trial. Amy and I were both asked to give victim impact statements. I went first and stood at the podium looking at Dean sitting next to his lawyer. I talked about sleeping in the hospital chairs while Mom went through chemo treatments. I described holding her hand when she couldn't sleep because of the pain. I told the judge about coming home from the hospital exhausted to find Dean had changed the locks during Mom's funeral. Then I explained how we discovered Dean had been counting rental cash and researching property theft while Amy and I were watching Mom die. I said Dean had stolen more than money or property. He'd stolen our ability to grieve our mother properly. We'd spent weeks dealing with his crimes instead of processing our loss. I kept my voice steady and just stated facts, but I could see Dean looking down at the table the whole time. Amy went next and talked about Mom asking for Dean during her final days. She described how Mom kept hoping he'd visit, and how she'd make excuses for why he was too busy. Amy told the judge that Mom died still believing Dean cared about her, never knowing he was just waiting to steal her house. By the time Amy finished, several people in the courtroom were crying. Dean's lawyer stood up after we were done and tried one more time to argue for probation. The judge cut him off and said she'd heard enough. The judge sentenced Dean to 18 months in county jail plus 5 years probation. He also had to pay back all $30,000 from the rental income and do community service at a homeless shelter after his release. The judge said the sentence reflected the extraordinary callousness of Dean's crimes, committing fraud during his own mother's funeral, and stealing from property that was meant to help homeless families. Dean's face went white when he heard 18 months. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge was done listening. The bailiff led Dean out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and he didn't look back at anyone. Amy squeezed my hand, and we both felt like Mom would have approved of the outcome. 2 weeks after the sentencing, Dean's wife called Amy. She said she was filing for divorce and wanted to apologize for not seeing what kind of person Dean really was. She explained she was moving back to her parents' house with the kids and wanted nothing to do with Dean after his release. She sounded exhausted and sad, like the whole situation had broken something in her. Amy told her we understood and didn't blame her for Dean's choices. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes and ended with her thanking us for being kind to her kids through everything. 4 months after Dean went to jail, Bernadette called to invite us to a dedication ceremony at Mom's house. The church had finished the renovation and turned it into a beautiful transitional living home for families. They'd repainted everything, updated the kitchen and bathrooms, and created 4 private bedroom spaces plus shared common areas. Bernadette said they were naming the program Nina's House in Mom's honor. Amy and I drove over on a Saturday morning for the ceremony. The house looked completely different, but somehow still felt like Mom's spirit was there. The church pastor gave a speech about Mom's generosity and how her gift would help dozens of families get back on their feet. Then Bernadette unveiled a wooden sign by the front door that said, Nina's House with the date it opened. I started crying seeing Mom's name there, knowing she'd planned all of this while we thought she was just avoiding Dean's questions about the will. After the ceremony, Bernadette introduced us to the first family moving in that afternoon. A single mother with 2 kids, maybe 7 and 9 years old, stood nervously in the living room holding garbage bags with their belongings. Bernadette explained they'd lost their apartment after medical bills from the son's surgery ate up all their savings. The mother started crying when she thanked us, saying she'd been sleeping in her car with the kids for 3 weeks. She kept apologizing for crying, and I told her Mom would have loved seeing her house used exactly this way. The little boy asked if they really got to stay there, and his mom nodded, and watching his face light up made everything with Dean feel worth it. Amy and I met for lunch the next week to talk about what to do with our inheritance money. We'd each gotten $50,000 from Mom's life insurance, and it felt right to use some of it to extend Mom's generosity. We decided to establish a small scholarship fund at Mom's church for kids from families in transitional housing. The fund would help with school supplies, field trips, and other expenses that families struggling to get back on their feet couldn't always cover. We set aside $10,000 each to start it, and the church agreed to manage the applications and distributions. Bernadette said several families already in their housing programs would benefit immediately. Setting up the scholarship took about 3 weeks of paperwork and meetings with the church's finance committee. Once everything was official, I started thinking about how else I could stay connected to Nina's house. I called Bernadette and asked if they needed volunteers. She said families often needed help with job applications and resume writing since many of them had gaps in employment from their housing instability. I'd worked in human resources for 6 years, so this felt like something useful I could actually do. I started volunteering at Nina's house once a month, usually on Saturday mornings. My first session, I helped a dad update his resume and practice interview questions. He'd been out of work for 8 months after losing his construction job and didn't know how to explain the gap to potential employers. We worked on framing it positively, and he got hired at a warehouse 2 weeks later. Connecting with the people Mom's gift was helping made me feel closer to her memory than visiting her grave ever did. 6 months after Dean's sentencing, his oldest daughter sent me a message on social media. She said her name was Sophie, she was 16, and she wanted to meet if we were willing. Her message explained she was ashamed of what her dad did, but didn't want to lose her whole family over his mistakes. She said her mom told her about Mom's will and the Airbnb scheme, and she understood if we wanted nothing to do with any of them. I showed the message to Amy, and we both agreed immediately that we should meet her. None of this was the kids' fault, and they deserve to know their grandmother's real legacy, not just their dad's crimes. We set up a coffee shop meeting for the following Saturday. Sophie showed up 15 minutes early, looking nervous and picking at her napkin. She had Mom's eyes and smile, which hit me harder than I expected. We hugged her and told her right away that we didn't blame her for anything Dean did. She started crying and said she'd been so scared we'd hate her. Amy ordered us all hot chocolate, and we spent 2 hours talking about Mom. Sophie said she barely remembered visiting Grandma's house because Dean never brought them around much. We told her stories about Mom's kindness, her terrible jokes, how she'd sneak candy to us when Dad said no sweets before dinner. Sophie laughed and cried and said she wished she'd known her grandmother better. Before we left, we exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. We started having monthly lunches with all 3 of Dean's kids after that first meeting with Sophie. The younger 2, Jake and Jenny, were 13 and 11. They were shy at first, but warmed up once we started sharing stories about Mom and showing them old photos on our phones. Jake looked exactly like Dean, but acted nothing like him, sweet and polite and interested in everyone else's feelings. Jenny asked a million questions about what Mom was like and whether she'd known about Dad's plan. We told her honestly that Mom had known Dean only cared about money, which is why she'd left the house to the church instead. The kids deserved to know their grandmother's real legacy and understand that family wasn't just about blood, it was about showing up and caring about people. We took them to Nina's house one Saturday, so they could see what their grandmother's gift had created. Sophie cried again seeing the sign with Nina's name on it. The kids met some of the families living there, and Jake asked a lot of questions about how the program worked. On the drive home, Jenny said she wanted to be like Grandma when she grew up, helping people who needed it. 3 months after we started the regular lunches, Bernadette called with an update about Nina's house. She said the program was exceeding all their expectations. 5 families had successfully transitioned to permanent housing after completing the program. They'd found stable jobs, saved up deposits, and moved into their own apartments. There was now a waiting list of 12 families wanting to participate. Bernadette said the church board was discussing opening a second location if they could find another property. She thanked us again for supporting the program and said Mom would be proud of how many lives her gift had changed. I thought about Dean sitting in county jail knowing that Mom's house was helping exactly the kind of people he'd never cared about. The program was working better than anyone expected, and families were getting real second chances because Mom had chosen compassion over convenience. Every month when I volunteered at Nina's house, I saw new faces and heard new stories of people rebuilding their lives. Mom's legacy wasn't the house itself or the money she'd left us. It was this ripple effect of kindness spreading out to touch dozens of families who just needed someone to believe they deserved a chance. A few weeks later, Bernadette called to say the local newspaper wanted to do a story about Nina's house. The reporter spent an afternoon interviewing families who'd gone through the program and asked us questions about Mom's decision to leave her home for homeless families instead of her children. The article ran on the front page of the lifestyle section with photos of the house and quotes from residents about how the program gave them stability when they needed it most. The headline read, "Local Woman's Final Gift Creates Second Chances," and focused on Mom's compassion and careful planning. Reading about Mom's values in print made me cry. but in a good way. The article mentioned Dean's attempt to steal the house during the funeral, which brought new attention to the case and made his actions even more public. 10 months into Dean's sentence, his lawyer contacted Clayton asking if Amy and I would support early release after Dean served 1 year instead of the full 18 months. Clayton forwarded us the request, and we talked about it over coffee at Amy's house. We weren't opposed to Dean getting out a few months early if he'd shown real change, but we also weren't going to actively advocate for it. We told Clayton to let the lawyer know we had no objection to early release, but wouldn't write letters or speak on Dean's behalf. Dean needed to serve his full sentence and prove he'd learned something from the consequences of his actions. Clayton passed along our response, and we didn't hear anything more about it, which meant Dean would stay in county jail for the full 18 months. 3 months before Dean's release date, Amy called me squealing with excitement. Her longtime boyfriend proposed during a weekend trip to the mountains, and she was getting married. We spent hours looking at venues and talking about wedding plans, and Amy decided she wanted to have the ceremony at Mom's church. Having the celebration in the place Mom loved, right near the house that was now helping people, felt meaningful and right. We booked the church for a Saturday afternoon 6 months out and started planning everything. Amy asked me to be her maid of honor and said she wanted to keep the wedding small and focused on family who actually cared about each other. We didn't send Dean an invitation. Around the same time, I started seriously house hunting with my inheritance money. Mom's $50,000 gave me enough for a solid down payment on a small 2-bedroom place about 15 minutes from Amy's house. I found a cute ranch with a fenced yard and made an offer that got accepted within a week. Closing day felt surreal, walking into the title company and signing papers that made me a homeowner. Every time I unlocked my own front door after that, I thought about Mom's careful planning and how she made sure Amy and I would be secure. She knew we'd use the money responsibly, while Dean would have just blown it on whatever he wanted. Standing in my own living room, I felt grateful for Mom's wisdom and the stability she'd given us even after she was gone. Dean served his full 18 months and got released on probation with strict conditions. His first required community service assignment was at the homeless shelter that benefited from Mom's house sale, which seemed perfectly fitting. Bernadette told us Dean showed up for his shifts on time and kept his head down, doing whatever tasks they assigned without complaint. He was required to complete 200 hours of service at the shelter, working in the kitchen and helping organize donations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Dean was now serving the exact people he'd never cared about, in a program funded by the house he'd tried to steal. We heard through Dean's ex-wife's sister that Dean was working at a warehouse doing inventory and living in a small apartment on the other side of town. His ex-wife had full custody of the kids with a court order, and Dean only got supervised visits twice a month at a family services center. The kids' grandmother supervised the visits because their mom didn't trust Dean alone with them yet. He was paying child support directly from his warehouse paychecks, and his probation officer checked in weekly to make sure he was following all the rules. It sounded like a hard, lonely life, but it was the life Dean had earned through his choices. 6 months after Dean's release, his oldest daughter reached out through social media asking if Amy and I would come to her high school graduation. Despite everything with Dean, we wanted to support our nieces and nephews who did nothing wrong. We told her we'd absolutely be there and asked if she needed help with her graduation party. She said her mom was handling the party, but she really wanted us at the ceremony because we were the only connection she had left to her grandmother. Amy and I bought her a nice gift and marked the date on our calendars. The graduation was at the high school auditorium on a Thursday evening in May. At the graduation ceremony, we sat with Dean's ex-wife and her parents in the family section. Dean sat by himself several rows back, looking uncomfortable in a button-down shirt that didn't fit quite right. After the ceremony ended, we were congratulating his daughter outside when Dean approached us carefully, keeping his distance like he wasn't sure if we'd talk to him. He thanked us quietly for staying in his kids' lives and said he appreciated that we didn't blame them for his mistakes. He looked tired and genuinely sorry, with dark circles under his eyes and a defeated posture. We kept the conversation brief and polite, telling him we hoped he was doing okay, then moved away to take photos with his daughter. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it also wasn't the anger we'd felt during the trial. 2 weeks after the graduation, Bernadette called to invite us to Nina's house 1-year anniversary celebration. The program was hosting a community event with food, tours of the facility, and speeches from families who'd completed the program. 12 families had successfully completed the program in that first year, finding stable jobs and moving into their own apartments. The church board was so impressed with the results they were considering opening a second location in a different neighborhood. Bernadette said the event was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, and she hoped we could attend because the program existed because of Mom's gift. Amy and I arrived at the anniversary celebration to find the yard decorated with balloons and tables set up with food donated by local restaurants. Current and former residents mingled with church members and community supporters, and kids ran around playing on the lawn where Mom used to plant flowers every spring. Bernadette welcomed everyone and introduced us as Nina's daughters, then invited us to speak about Mom and her decision to leave the house for this program. Amy went first, talking about Mom's values and her belief that everyone deserved a safe place to rebuild their lives. I followed, sharing how Mom had carefully planned everything to turn what could have been a bitter family fight over inheritance into something beautiful that helped dozens of people. Standing there looking at the house with its sign reading Nina's house and seeing families who'd found stability through Mom's generosity, I knew she would have been proud of what her final gift created. After we finished speaking, Bernadette invited former residents to share their experiences. A woman in her 30s stood up holding hands with two kids who looked about 7 and 9. She said her name was Jennifer, and she'd lived at Nina's house last year after losing her apartment when her son needed emergency surgery. The medical bills wiped out her savings, and she couldn't make rent anymore. She explained how the program gave her family stability during the hardest time of their lives, letting her keep her job while her kids stayed in the same school district. Her voice cracked when she said Nina's house meant her children didn't have to sleep in their car or bounce between shelters. 3 other families shared similar stories about finding safety and support when everything fell apart. One man talked about getting back on his feet after his wife died, and he couldn't handle the bills alone. Another woman described escaping an abusive relationship with nowhere to go until Nina's house took her in. Listening to their stories, I understood something important. Mom's legacy wasn't the physical house or the money she left behind. It was this ripple effect of kindness she created by choosing compassion over convenience. Dozens of people had better lives because Mom looked past her own family drama and thought about strangers who needed help. She could have split the house between us or sold it and divided the money, but instead she turned it into something that kept helping people long after she was gone. That felt more valuable than any inheritance check. After the celebration ended, Amy and I drove to the cemetery where Mom was buried. We stood at her grave with flowers from the anniversary event and told her everything that happened. Amy talked about Dean serving his sentence and losing his family because of his greed. I described Nina's house and all the families who found stability there. We thanked Mom for teaching us that real family isn't about blood or inheritance. It's about love and doing right by others, even when it costs you something. Mom proved that by leaving her house to help strangers instead of feeding Dean's selfishness or making things easier for us. She taught us to think beyond ourselves. Driving home from the cemetery, I felt genuinely at peace for the first time since Mom died. Dean faced real consequences for what he did. Mom's house was helping people exactly like she wanted. Amy and I were building lives Mom would be proud of with the inheritance she carefully planned for us. The whole situation took almost 2 years to fully resolve, but it was worth the wait. Justice doesn't always come quickly, but sometimes it comes exactly right.